Okay, so in this video, we're going to build a to-do app using Django and a backend that we set up with the Django REST framework. So I've made a video like this before, but now what we're actually going to do is work with an API that we set up and use JavaScript on the front end to make those API calls and actually handle that CRUD functionality. So if you take a look at our app here, we're able to update items just by clicking on them, crossing them off the list. And if I want to update something, I could just go ahead and do something like this and say update and also add a new item. So this is all done asynchronously. So if you look at our console here, every move I made rendered out a new set of data for us. So what's happening here is JavaScript is making an API call to the backend, and everything we do, it returns more data for us and re-renders out this page. So we're going to work off of this REST API that we built out using the Django REST framework. And this is where we are pulling data from. So if you want to follow along with this video, in the first part, I actually set up this backend. So I'll recommend you follow along with that, get all of this set up. And then in this video, all we're going to do is make API calls to that and handle this on the front end. So I am going to upload the source code to the start of this project and the final version. So you could just work with that if you already understand the Django REST framework, but I would highly recommend you see what we did in the first video, which I will link up, and follow along with that. Okay, so before we get started with the to-do app, let's go ahead and recap what we set up in the last video. So this is our API that we built out. And if you take a look here, these are the URL patterns that we can visit. So this is just to get the data in a list, to view an individual item, create an item, update an item, and to delete an item. So we have those URL patterns, and here are the views that go with those. So again, these are all API views because of this decorator, and they all take in a different method. So this one takes in delete, post, and get request for the detail and the list. And we have our serializer and our model of tasks. So that kind of summarizes the entire project right there. And we also do have an app that we called API, and that's just the way we set this one up. But now what we're gonna do is create a new app, and we will just call this one front end. So this new app will just pull the data from this API, and we'll just reference these URLs. So let's go ahead and do that. And we're just gonna call the new app front end. So Python manage.py start app, and we'll just say front end, and that should give us our new app. So let's go ahead and configure that. So here we go, front end, and we need to go into settings.py and make sure we have that. So our project is todo_drf, and in here I'm just going to copy this and add in the new app. So we have two apps, API and front end is going to pull in from that. So let's go ahead and change this front end, and this will be to front end config. Front end config, and that should do it. So let's go ahead and run our server, and we're going to configure our URLs right now. So Python manage.py run server, and let's take a look and see what we have so far. So right now, if we go to our project, all of our URLs here, so if we go to the base URL, we get nothing because we didn't configure that. But if we go to API, we're able to go to these paths and actually access everything. And that is because if we go to our main project file, we don't have a relative path to that template. So that's what we're going to set up now. So now let's go ahead and set that up. We'll just create a path, and this will be that base URL, and we'll just include frontend.urls. So frontend.urls, and we'll create that file and render a template now. So let's go ahead and set that up. So in front end, let's create that folder, and let's say templates. And within templates, we need a file called front end, so the name of our app, and we will just call this one index.html. Actually, let's just go ahead and call that list.html because it's a little bit more appropriate for what we have here. So let's just make sure we can see that when we render it, and we'll just say hello. And now for our URLs, In order to set that up, we need to create that file. And I know this is a lot of basic stuff, but I just want to make sure that I don't copy and paste too much code or confuse anyone here. So I do want to start from the beginning. So urls.py, I'm just going to go ahead and copy everything from that the API URL, and we will reset these and go ahead and just render out the list, which is going to be the view that we're going to create. So list, and we'll just call this one list. So I'm kind of doing things backwards here, but now in our views, in the front end app within views, let's go ahead and create that. So we'll just say new function, list, request, and we will just return that template. So return, render, and we're just going to do front end / list.html. So that should set it up. I don't think I mix anything up here. Let's go ahead and close out a bunch of these tabs because we are starting to open up too much here. So there's our model, our URLs, and let's give this a test. So now if we go to that URL, my server's on. Let's try to restart that. Okay, so now if we go to that home page, we should see our dashboard appear. Okay, so there we go. We have our template. So now what I'm going to do is actually set up that HTML and CSS. For this, I will copy and paste, but I'll go line by line just to get this set up, and we'll start making API calls. So let's go ahead and in our template here, so in list.html, I'm going to start setting things up. So let's go ahead and create our HTML tag, and we'll set that up. We'll just say to do. And the first thing we'll import is going to be Bootstrap and some fonts. So within the head tag, make some space here. We'll paste in Bootstrap. So you can grab that from the Bootstrap CDN, and or just use my source code. And here is the font we're going to work with. Again, not too relevant to the app, but I do want to make sure there is styling. So for the rest of the styling, I am actually going to handle this inline. So I don't want to have to connect static files or anything like that for a tutorial like this. So we'll go ahead and just do everything in here. So the first thing we'll do is set up our background color. And this is going to be what you saw in that demo, which is a gradient blue and green background. So if you want to take a look at this, we'll actually need to add something to our template so we can actually see it. So you rewrite hello there. And let's see what that gives us. So for the template, that's just going to give us this background. So now what we want to do is apply that font that we just imported, and we want to apply it to all the text we're going to use. So we're just going to apply that to H1 through strike tag, and we're just going to apply this Google font that we wanted in here. Now, what else, or the next thing we want to do is apply that container styling. So task container is just going to be the wrapper that's going to contain all of the elements in here. So if I want to set up that HTML, I'll actually copy that in right now and we'll style it. So not in the styling, but within the body here. So here we're using a Bootstrap container. The container here will hold all the elements. So it ends right here. It wraps everything up here. And then we have our form wrapper that ends right here, and our list wrapper that will contain the items. So if I refresh this, you should see, actually, if we have a list here. So that's that wrapper that we just styled. So let's go ahead and finish up the styling with a few more things here. So the next thing we want to do is add some styling to the form wrapper, which will give us some padding here and make that look a little better. So if we want to see that, let's go ahead and refresh that. There we go. So it gives us that styling, and we also want to style that submit button. So we'll put that in. That'll make that button green, and we change the ID of that button to submit. And we're also using the flex grid here to make sure that's in line. And I'll just paste in two more classes, which is going to be that flex wrapper and task wrapper. So this will be the actual list. So flex wrapper is referenced right here around that input field and the button. So didn't want to spend too much time on this section, but there we go. So now once we start outputting data, our list will appear down here and it's going to look good. So if we go to our CSS, we didn't add too much. We just add a little HTML and some styling. So let's go ahead and start writing some JavaScript here. And I'll just go ahead and include that. I believe I should put that into or inside the body tag. Yeah, so we'll just put that in here and we'll just say script. And this is where we're going to start rendering our data. So let's go ahead and make an API call and render out some stuff from our backend. So I'll just add in some comments here, and this is something that I'll reference later, but I like to do this when I'm building apps here so I can understand the data flow and the structure. So I'll throw that in and cover each piece line by line as we go. And the first function we're going to build is going to be called build list, and this function is going to be responsible for calling data and outputting it to our wrapper there. So we want to first select our wrapper to where that where those items will be output to. So we want to get the ID of list wrapper. So we'll just do wrapper is going to equal to document dot get element by ID, and that will just be list dash wrapper. And now we need to call the data. So I'm going to use a fetch API for this. So we'll just set the URL. So the URL we're going to call to at the beginning at least is going to be this data right here. So if we go back here, we want to call this URL and retrieve this in an array of JSON objects. So we'll throw that in and let's go ahead and do fetch. So fetch, and we'll just do dot then, and actually we need to pass in the URL. So we'll throw that in and dot then, and we need to get that data and turn it into a JSON response. So we'll just do RSP, and that will be an arrow function, and we're just going to do RSP, so response dot JSON, and we're going to convert that. And once we have that data, we're going to do dot then again, and we need to actually console this data out. I just want to make sure we made that call properly. So function, and this time we're going to use a normal function, and we'll just go ahead and console.log, and we need to pass in data right here so we can actually reference it. And let's go ahead and just do data and console that out. So again, if you're following this, I recommend you either just follow this step by step. Definitely read into the fetch API if you haven't used it. I've used jQuery in the past, but I'm trying to get away from that and use something more native to JavaScript. So if we go to our app now and inspect, we should see this data consoled out here if that ran properly. We actually need to call the function, I just realized. So let's go ahead, and once we make the function up here, we can actually just call it. So build list, and that's going to call the function on load. So there we go. So we now have our data, and we made a successful API call to the database. So let's go ahead and actually render this. So we'll loop through the list here, and we're just going to go ahead and output the data and append it to this wrapper right here. So what I'm going to do is set the value of data to this variable list, and that's going to be equal to data. And we're just going to create a for loop, and we'll just say for var I in list. And let's go ahead and create an element on each iteration. So what I'm going to do is create a div that will contain the title and some buttons, and then we'll append it. So we're just going to say var item. And again, this is created on each iteration, and we're going to use template literals here. And I'm going to create a div, and this is going to be the wrapper to each item to the actual data itself. So we're going to create the div. And within here, I'm going to call this div, and I'm actually going to copy and paste some stuff here, and I'll explain what's going on. So I'll paste that in here. So we're going to give each item its own ID. So the ID is going to be data-row and whatever iteration we're currently on based on that. And we're also going to have the class name of task wrapper, which will give it this styling, which you'll see in a second. And we're also going to give it flex wrapper, so we're able to style those items in line. So now what we want to do is throw in some span tags, and in here first we're gonna set up the flex wrapper. So we're just gonna do div, and we're gonna wrap each item within this row with this flex wrapper. So we're gonna style it inline. So I'll just do style is gonna be equal to, make sure to actually put the L there. So this one will be flex, and we want this to be the bigger item in that row. So we'll just do that. And there we'll throw in the span tag, and we'll access the list item title there. So if you look at that response, we're grabbing each item's title right here. So that's how we're able to access it in a JSON response. So what I'll do is actually copy and paste this 3 times. So this one's gonna be flex 1 because these are buttons. So we want them aligned to the right. And in here, what we're gonna do is just throw in a button. So I'm gonna say edit button for this one. So we're gonna create a button, give it the class of BTN, the bootstrap class, BTN small, and we're gonna outline it and give it the class of edit, which we'll reference later. And for this one, this is gonna be a button. It's just gonna have a dash, and when we click on it, we just wanna delete it. And we're gonna give it the bootstrap styling of outline and dark. So once we create the item, what we wanna do now is append each item to that list wrapper. So we gave it the ID of wrapper here. So we queried that list wrapper. And within the loop, we wanna make sure that it's in here. Because we're creating each element, we wanna do wrapper.inner HTML, and we'll just do plus equals, and that's where we are throwing in the item here. So let's go ahead and save that, refresh it, and make sure it's working. So there we go. That's all the styling we applied. I'd recommend just looking into that and seeing how I output that. But right now we're outputting the data. Nothing's actually working. We can't really do anything with it, but we've rendered out the data and we've made a successful API call. So it's starting to come together. So now what we need to do is actually give ourselves the ability to create items on that form submission. So let's go ahead and do that. So outside of this function, this build list function, what I'm gonna do is create an event listener. And on our form, we give it the ID of form-wrapper. So I'll copy that, and we'll just go ahead and create a variable called form. So var form, and that's gonna be equal to document.get element by ID, and we'll just throw in that form wrapper. So we have the form, and we're just gonna say form.add event listener. And the event listener we wanna listen for is gonna be submit, or the event we wanna listen to is submit, and we'll just go ahead and add the function. And the first thing we wanna do is prevent the form from submitting on its own. So we want to take care of everything with JavaScript. So we're gonna do prevent default, and that's gonna stop our form from submitting. And let's just go ahead and console it out and make sure it's working. So just console out form submitted, but it won't send any data. So form submitted, and let's go ahead and give it a try, make sure the event handler is added, and did something wrong here. Let's see what's going on. Document.get element by ID. Oh, I forgot to put equals here. So form equals document.get element by ID, and now that should work. Okay, so when we submit our form, we're gonna see this alert, but nothing's gonna happen. So let's go ahead and actually submit some data, and we're actually gonna run into an error because of the way we're sending our CSRF token, because in Django, we normally add this into the form, but we're using JavaScript to submit this. So I'll run into the error and then show you how to fix it. So to submit the post data, we're also gonna use the fetch API, and I am actually gonna grab this URL and just update it. So we're gonna throw that in here, and this is gonna be task-create, and that's just the way we set up our API. If we go to the URL patterns, if we go to API and URL, so task create will create the task for us. So let's go ahead and set up that fetch call, and we'll just do fetch. And in here, what we're gonna do is throw in the URL, and now we actually need to throw in some parameters. So we're gonna create a dictionary here, and we're gonna say method, and that's gonna equal to post. And we're also gonna pass in some headers. So headers is gonna be another dictionary, and we're just gonna say content type. And I need to make that capital C right there. So content dash type. And this is going to be application / JSON. So application / JSON there. And we're not going to pass in that CSRF token yet, but it is going to go underneath here. So once we have that, we're also going to throw in the body. So what data do we want to send? And body is going to be that data stringified. So I'll just do JSON.stringify, and I'll explain what's going on here in a second. So we're going to stringify any data that we throw in here. So what we're going to do now is actually throw in an object, and I'm just going to call it title, or so the attribute's going to be title because that's what we're trying to send to the backend. And the title we're going to get, I'll throw in the variable here, but we'll grab it right here and we'll just say title is going to be equal to document.getElement by ID. So I'll just go ahead and grab this, and instead of having to type that out, and this this element is going to be that form field. So we're going to get this element right here. So the ID is title. So we're going to grab whatever is in here. So we're going to do document.getElement by ID. And where is that? Okay, so that's the title. So we're going to do title.value. So the ID name is title. And we just want to get the value of it. So we're going to grab that value and we're going to throw it into this object. And again, because we're using the fetch API, we're going to stringify it, and then we're going to send it to the backend. So once that's done, once we send the data, what we want to do now is actually call that build list again. So we want to submit data and we want to re-render that list. So there's different ways you can do this. I just re-render the list each time. So we'll do .then, and in here, we're just going to do function, and we're going to get the response, and we'll just say build list. So we'll call that function again, and we'll just go ahead and add a comma there. We need to make sure to close that off there. And if I refresh this, we should see an error, and we are going to get a bunch of rows output here because we need to refresh this. So let me show you what I mean. We'll just say latest item. And if I submit this, we should get back a response that gives us an error. And I'm not exactly sure how this works with the Django REST framework, but I do still think we need to send that CSRF token. I'm still doing a little research on it, but I'll just go ahead and add that and fix this error for now. So what's happening here is the data was submitted and it didn't run because we didn't send a CSRF token with it. So it gave us an error, but we did run that run build function again. So we have the same data twice. So new item update. So it's just repeating it. So what we need to do is actually go ahead and in our build list function, we are going to clear out the wrapper on each new render. So any rows in there, before we re-render new rows, we're going to go ahead and clear it out. So we're just going to say inner.html, and that's going to equal to just a string value, which will just set our wrapper to just an empty div, and then we'll go back through that process and render out each row. So now I'm going to drag in the Django documentation for that CSRF token. And if you, I'll actually link this up, but if you look up how to send that CSRF token with Ajax, Django actually gives us a way to create one and send it with our post data if we're submitting it with Ajax. So I'll copy that, and at the top of our script here, so just under our notes, I'm going to go ahead and paste that in, and we'll fix this up, and I'll explain what's going on here. We don't need to know the details of what's going on here, but basically Django is creating a token for us and throws it into this variable. So now in our post data, we can actually add it to our headers here. So in our headers, we can add it as, we'll do a string value here, and we'll just say x-CSRF token, and then we'll just do colon, and we'll grab this token right here. So just make sure that's in here. You can store it any way you want as long as you can reference it. I put this in a different JavaScript file and just rendered it, but we can grab that. And now when we submit the data, the token will be sent with that post data, and then our list will be cleared, and we'll see new data rendered out in a completely different way. So it won't build up on top of it. So let's go ahead and try this. So we'll just say latest item, and I'll hit submit. And there we go. So that item was just added. And one thing I want to do is invert it so the latest item is at the top. So I'll go back to my view, and in my views.py file in here, we'll just say order by, and normally you want to do this by date or something like that, but I'm just going to do it by ID because my IDs are integers. So we'll just say ID. And now when we refresh it, you'll notice that list item should be on the top now. So there we go. So there's a few things I want to do here. When we create a form, we also want to clear that form field. So right now, if we submit it, the form will still stay with the element that was currently in it. So on submit, after we build, let's go ahead and do document. Let's go ahead and actually grab this right here. And we'll just say document.get element by ID. And the name of our form is just form. So that, just to make sure that that's all correct. Up here, our form is called form. So we're just going to do form dot reset. So this will just clear our form data. So we'll do form dot reset, and let's go ahead and see what this does. So now if I add an item, I'll just do 1. It's at the top. And what's going on here? Reset isn't a function. Looks like I misspelled that. Reset. Okay, so now when I add these items, so it still added it, but if I just go ahead and do 2, there we go. So our form is now cleared and the items are being added. So there's something else I want to show you here with that form. So I'll go ahead and add a few more items here. So if I just do this, and you'll notice that every time I refresh it, we see this kind of this flash, and that's because the page is re-rendering. So this gets rebuilt each time. So I also added this effect here where it stays, it pretty much gets fixed to the top of this inner wrapper. So if you want to see that, that's in this CSS right here. I won't go into detail, but this allows us to set that up. But why that can be a problem is, let's say we want to update this item here. Well, if we're scroll down and let's say we click it, we want to edit it, we just make some kind of edit. We'll just say, just add in some data there. We automatically get sent back to the top because what happens is this table or this wrapper gets shrunk and then rebuilt. So we'll fix that later, but for now, I just wanted to show you that error and show you how to clear the form. So let's go ahead and get into updating items. So we'll actually give ourselves the ability to click on that edit button and start editing an item. Okay, so for this next part, I'm gonna go as slow as possible because I do need to explain what's going on here, because editing could get a little tricky in the way that I'm doing it. And this is the best way I can figure out how to make this happen. So just to recap, the way that that submission process worked was that we grabbed the form data and we sent it to the backend, and this dictionary stringified just gets sent back to our view. So in this view, we take in that data right there, we throw it into the serializer, and we say if serializer is valid, just like we would a form, we save it and we return a response. So there's a few things that we need to do with the edit item. So first, we're going to create a function that is going to be called edit item, and it's going to trigger whenever we click on one of these buttons here. So anytime we click one of these, we're going to just console out edit button was clicked, and we want to specify which item was clicked. So let's go ahead and do that. And just under this form submission, this event listener, we're going to create a function called edit item. So edit item, and for now we're just going to console out item click. So console.log, and we're just going to say item clicked. Okay, so this is where I realized I knew JavaScript a little less than I thought I did. So I thought that in our loop here, so as we build each item, we can just go ahead and select this class in the current iteration and add an event handler. So let's go ahead and try that, and I'll show you what happens. So I'll try to run this step by step. So we're going to create a new variable called edit btn, and this was just going to be document.get elements, because we're doing class, so get elements by class name, and we're going to get the edit class, and we want to get the current iteration. So in this case, we're looping with the variable of I, so we're just going to get the current button here. So once we do that, the logic that I had was that we can just go ahead and add an event listener. So add event listener, and we were just going to go ahead and trigger it on click. Need to throw an L in there. And on click, we're just going to do function. And we were just going to trigger this edit item event. So let's go ahead and see what happens once we do this. So right here, we'll trigger it, and let's give that a test. So if I refresh that and click it, nothing happens. And if I click on the last item, there we go, the function triggers. So what's happening here is, because we're doing this through that loop, it's actually not storing that value and adding it only to the last iteration. So that event only gets added here. I won't go into detail on why that's happening, but I had to read a bunch of articles to understand what was going on, but definitely don't know enough to actually explain it. So again, the event only gets added to the last item. So the solution was to go ahead and grab all of this. So let's grab this loop right here. And at the end of the loop, so it ends right here, we're going to loop through one more time. So once it gets built, we're just going to create one more loop and do this in here. So this solves the temporary problem. So now if I do this and go ahead and refresh that, we should get that event triggered on each item click. So the next problem occurred when I wanted to add in an object. So I wanted to be able to pass in the current item. So let's just say list I. I wanted to be able to throw that in here and then be able to actually work with it. So let's say we want to click on that item and we want to see which item we're working with, because we want to be able to manipulate it and fill in this form. So if I do that, what's happening here is the item is working with each button, but the object itself is actually only this last object. So if you look in the console, no matter what item I click on, so if I click on 2, we're always going to get this last item, configure URLs and basic response. So it doesn't change. So the only object that gets passed in is the last one. So it's kind of like that first object or that first issue that we ran into when the event was only passed into the last one. So the solution is immediately invoked function expressions. And I won't go into trying to explain what that is, but I'll just show you the solution. So I would highly recommend looking those up and seeing how we can actually make this work. So at the end of our event, what we're going to do is change up how we return our function. So what we're going to do now is on click, we have our function, and we are going to pass in the parameter. So I call my parameter, we'll just do item. So we'll follow this. We'll throw an item right here, and we're going to just remove this for now. So I have it copied, and we're going to return a new function in here. So basically this is going to allow us to store the variable in that function. So I'm probably butchering how I'm explaining this, but essentially we have our function, we have our parameter, we return another function, and then we return item. And where we're going to pass in the actual task is going to be at the end. So at the end here, we're going to do another set of parentheses. And just to clear this up, we have our event listener that ends right here. And right here, we're just going to pass in our, not the function itself, but this list item. So list I, and that's going to be the actual object. So this is going to let us store that reference in that local state for that function. So once we set that up and we go down here, we're consoling the item. I probably completely butchered the explanation, but I'll show you what that does. So let's see what's going on here. Event listener is not a function. I actually think we need to be inside of the event listener. Give me a second to fix this. So we actually need to wrap this function and add one more set of parentheses there. So it kind of looks funny. And now if I save that and go ahead and see this, make sure it looks right. Okay, so now when I click on 2, we should see 2. And when I click on last item, we should see last item. So the object is being passed in, and there's a reason why I'm trying to do this. So in my script here, we're gonna set a variable called active item, and it's gonna have, it's gonna be a global variable. So var active item is always gonna be set to null. So by default, active item is null. And the point of this is to know whether we are editing an item or creating a new one. So whenever edit item gets clicked, it does two things. It sets active item to the object that we clicked on. So that's why we needed to store that reference. And we also need to set the value of form to this item. So let's go ahead and do this. So document.get element by ID. And we're only doing one value here. So we're just going to set title, and we're just going to do dot value is going to be equal to active item dot title. So because active item is going to be set to whatever object we clicked on, so it's going to be one of these. It has a dot title. So now we're just going to do active item dot title here, and it's just going to set it right now. So let's go ahead and test this out first before we handle submission. So now when we click on an item, each item I click on will appear here. So active item is set, and the form is now pre-populated with that item. So the last thing we need to do with active item is handle submission. So we need to make sure that the form knows whether to send it to a new item or one that we already have. So we just need to change up the URL, and title will always stay the same. So what we're going to do is by default, the URL is set to create, and we need to ask a question. So we're going to say if, and we're going to use active item. So if active item is not equal to null, let's go ahead and change the URL. So it means we want to edit an item. So I'll just grab this URL, and in here, we'll just go ahead and change this to task update. And we are going to pass in that active item, which is why we want to store it globally. So we want to pass in the active item ID. So I'm going to change these to template literals, and let's go ahead and fix that. Okay, so active item dot ID. So now we're actually sending it to a specific item's URL. So the URL is changed, and after we submit it, we want to change active item back to null. So we've preset the URL, and we go ahead and reset that. So now if I go ahead and pick an item, so for, and just go ahead and do updated. So for is now updated. So what happened is, because the item was active, we sent it to this URL, which pulls up this view here. So item update or task update. We query the task based off of the ID. We set the instance, pass in the new data, and the item gets updated. So that's what that does for us. Next, we'll handle actually striking out data, deleting it, and we'll fix that render. So let's go ahead and create that delete method. So under edit item, we're going to create a new function, and this one's going to be called delete item function, and we'll just do delete item, and we'll pass in the item. So we're also going to throw in the object, and we actually want to reference the ID, so that's why we need to do this. And delete item. What we're going to do now for this, let's just go ahead and console it out and say delete clicked, just to make sure it's all working. So delete clicked, and up here, we're actually going to use that same loop and grab the delete button. So if you look here, we also added the same ID like we did to edit, but we added ID as a class name. So, we added delete as a class name, not ID. So in here, what we're going to do is go ahead and create an edit button variable or a delete button variable, and this will just be delete, and we'll grab that class. So again, we're just querying that one instance of it, and in here, we're actually going to copy the same exact method. So we're going to go ahead and move this down, create some space here, and this is where we're going to handle delete. So delete is going to be added as an event handler here. On click, go ahead and run delete item. So let's test this and make sure the object is passed in. So if I refresh that, there we go, delete clicked. And I actually already know the object is being passed in because we're using the same method, so I just forgot to console that, but we know it's working. So for delete, anytime we click it, we want to, in this function, just go ahead and use the fetch method here and send a delete request to our database. So if you look at our view, it takes in delete instead of post. So let's go ahead and set that up. So our URL is going to be, we'll actually just copy one of these here. So let's actually grab this entire thing because we're just grabbing the item. We're just going to set the URL to that, and we need to get the item ID, not the active item ID. So after this, what we need to do is go ahead and send some more data. So we add a comma, and we're going to go ahead and set method to delete. So if you look at our view, we only accept the delete method. So we'll throw that in, delete. And in our headers, we're just going to go ahead and add what we had before. So headers, colon, and in this dictionary, let's go ahead and just grab what we used earlier. So the CSRF token and the content type. So we're going to pass in that data. We're going to send in that item's ID. So now we just have to go ahead and rebuild that list. So we'll go ahead and throw in the response. And here we're just going to do an arrow function and run build. So let's go ahead and grab build list, paste that in. So this should now delete an item for us by sending it to this view and go ahead and just rebuild that for us. So if I refresh this and we do delete, there we go. So now we're deleting items. Let's go ahead and add the ability to click on these and either strike them out as complete or maybe undo that. So let's go ahead and create a function called strike unstrike, and we'll just do strike unstrike, so U will be capitalized, and we'll go ahead and pass in the item again, and not items but item, and we're just going to test this again by consoling it out and making sure that the event handler works. So console.log, and we'll just say strike clicked, and now we can grab this function and bring it up here. So edit, delete, and we're actually just going to repeat this too. So at the end of this event listener, we'll just add it here. So delete button, and I'll remove that from there. Pass in that strike unstrike function, list item, and we need to get this strike button here. So we'll just copy this, and we'll call this one title because that's what it is. And I think I called it title in class. Yeah, so I just want to stay consistent with that. In theory, I probably should name that to strike. But in here, we're just going to say title, on click, go ahead and run strike unstrike. So if I test this, let's go ahead and refresh it. Now on click, we should see that event handler working. So it's all working. Let's actually process the functionality. So the functionality will actually be a lot like the delete method, where down here, I'll actually copy most of this right here, and we want to also rebuild a list. So everything from fetch to the end of that then response there. So we have that, and we'll say task, and what did I call this one? Where am I sending it? Let's go ahead and take a look. So in my view, we want to update it. So we're just going to go ahead and send it to the update method, but we're just sending different data. So update, and we're going to send this as post. And for the body, what we want to do is pass in the complete status, and I'll just go ahead and throw in the title. I'm not sure if we can submit it without that. I don't remember if I required it, but we're just going to go ahead and send that. So we'll just say title, and title is going to be equal to whichever item we have, dot title. So we'll just pass that back in. And the completed attribute, so if we go to our model and look at this, we have our completed attribute. So we'll set completed to the value of item.completed. So item.completed, and we need to make sure that every time we click this, we get the opposite of what the last value was. So right here, what I'm going to say is item.completed is going to be equal to the item.completed, but inverted. So if item.completed is true, this time it's going to be false. And if we click on it again, if it's false now, it's going to be true. So it'll invert every single time. we're just going to send that back to that update view, and we should get our list rebuilt. So let's go ahead and test that. So if I click on it, and it looks like we have a bad request. Let's see what's going on here. Oh, I think it's because I didn't stringify the data. So let's go ahead and do JSON.stringify, and we'll just go ahead and close that and close that off right here. So now if I do that, that should update the data. So let's go ahead and try that. So latest item, there we go. So if I look right here, completed is now true. So what I want to do now is make sure that each time we render this out, we have something that checks whether that item is completed or not, and renders it out as crossed out or just as a span tag. So let's go ahead and update that. So for that, we're going to go up to our to this item right here, wherever we render it. And what I want to do is check the condition and change the value of this. So up here, what I'm going to do is create a new item, and we're going to set this to var title. And title is just going to be just a span tag here. So let's go ahead and grab this and throw it in here. So let's use template literals, throw that in there. And in here, what I'm going to do is change this to that dynamic value. So we're going to grab this title and we'll throw it in here. So what I need to do now is check a conditional and change the value if our item is completed. So we're going to say if, and go and close that out. So if the current iteration, if the item in the current iteration right now is completed, whoops, that's a square brackets there. So dot completed. So if completed is equal to true, let's go ahead and set the value of title. So we'll grab this and we'll change the value to strike. So instead of span, we'll say strike, and strike will just cross it out for us. So we'll return the same exact thing, except we're now crossed out, and this value gets thrown in there. So let's go ahead and refresh that and give it a test. So if I refresh it, we click on this item, it's now striked out and reloads every time. So this successfully changes the value of the item and actually crosses it out. So the last thing I want to fix is this little effect right here. So you notice every time we click, you're seeing this, I keep calling it a flash method, but basically it looks like a little glitch here. That's the page re-rendering. So on the first iteration of the loop, we clear out this wrapper. I'm sure you remember that. So we clear out the wrapper and we re-render that data. So one problem that can occur here is, and I think I mentioned this earlier, but whenever we're trying to update an item down the list, so let's say that we want to update this. So let's go ahead and just say update. And when we save that, we want to keep our current placement and actually be able to see that update take effect. So this is kind of a little bonus. We're done with all the CRUD functionality. This is more of just a front end thing. So I found one solution here, and I'm not sure if this is the best method, but basically what we're doing here is we're adding an item, or we're adding an ID to each row, and instead of clearing out the entire wrapper here before we delete it, what we're gonna do is actually, before we add a new item, we're gonna query the item with that ID that was previously there, and we're gonna remove it. So basically, if you imagine it looping this way right here, so this item would get removed and the new one would get added. This one would get removed, new one would get added, and so on. So I don't know if that makes sense, but let's go ahead and try this. I'll just go ahead and keep accidentally closing out the text editor here. So in here, we're gonna start with the original loop. So within our wrapper, we're gonna comment this out. So if you wanna keep that, I'll just leave it there just so you can reference it. And what we're gonna do is grab each element by ID. So let's create some space. And we're gonna say document.get element by ID. So on each iteration, what we wanna do is, if you look at this, we have an ID for each item. So we're gonna get data row, and we're gonna use template literals for this because we need to pass in the ID based on the iteration. We're gonna grab that element and we're gonna remove it. So one problem that will occur with this is if that element doesn't exist, it's gonna give us an error. So what we're gonna use is just a try catch, and Again, if you really know how to do this, I'm probably very inexperienced. This is something that I kind of just faced the issue and found a way to solve it. I don't know if this is the best method. So we'll just say try catch. And if we do get an error, just go ahead and ignore it. And I believe I have to put in something here. And before I make a stupid mistake here, this needs to be in our loop, not in the beginning of build list. So we commented that out, and that's what threw me off. So in the beginning of this loop, we'll throw that in here, and I'll just fix that indentation. So basically what we're saying is if there's data there, go ahead and grab it by the ID based on the iteration and remove it. So it basically won't remove an item until we have something to replace it. So this is going to solve part of the problem, and I'll show you what I mean by this. So if we remove this item, what's happening here is we're replacing it with the last item on the list. So our first list right here, let me refresh this again. Our first list is, it has 5 items in it, or our first array has 5 items. If I remove it, it now has 4. So it didn't remove this last item. So this last item actually gets added in twice. So to solve the second part of the issue, and by the way, if you notice, you don't get that flash, basically that little glitch that we saw earlier. So it's fixing that at least. So what we need to do to fix this is outside of our build list, I'm going to go ahead and create basically a snapshot of our list. So up here, I'm just going to say list snapshot, and I think I'll put it up here just to make sure that we can actually use it and keep consistent with our global variables. And the sole purpose of list snapshot is to always have some kind of reference to what our data looked like before. So I'm going to try to explain this as simple as possible, but basically we set the value of list to the new data that we have. And after the loop, we're going to go ahead and set list snapshot to whatever we had in the list. But before we actually change the value of list snapshot, what we're going to do is run a conditional, and we're going to say if, and set that up, if list snapshot dot length is greater than the list that we currently have, so the list that we were just got back from the response, so list dot length. So if the old list had more items than the new list, it means that there are going to be extra rows like we saw here, and we need to go ahead and remove those. So our new list has 2 items now, but the last item didn't get deleted. So that's what's happening here, and this basically lets us know, hey, go ahead and continue on and delete the rest of the items. So I'm going to write a little conditional, and I'll just explain what happened after. So we're just going to grab, or I'll try to explain as I go. So we'll set var I, and that's going to be equal to list.length. So we're basically going to grab the list, the new list at the last index. So we're going to grab the length, and we're going to set that to I. So if our new list is 3, we're basically going to start off there, and we're going to start a new loop to delete the rest of the items. So we'll say when I is less than list.snapshot.length. So when we're still smaller than the old list, let's go ahead and grab the rest of the items and remove them. So we'll grab document.getElement by ID, and let's go ahead and remove that element. So we then set the list snapshot to what the list looked like before we re-render more. So we kind of have it stored in memory. And I did mess this up a little bit, and we need to do I++. And now if I actually go to this, you'll see the effect. So if it didn't make sense, at least we can see what's happening here. So if I just add a bunch of new items, let's go ahead and submit them. And if I delete them, there we go. So we're not having that error anymore. So let's go ahead and test out that issue that I was telling you about with updating an item way down the list. So I added a bunch of elements here. And if I scroll down here, let's say I want to update this, and I want to be able to still see it as I update it. So we add it into the form, and that's actually the reason why I made this fixed right here. We add it into the form, and we just say updated. We submit that. It gets updated without that that little glitch occurring and that data being rendered, or the data still being rendered, but the list in the way that we're rebuilding it is allowing us to see it happen basically live without having to re-render the actual form fields the way we had them earlier, or the rows. So we can actually go ahead and just remove items, and everything should be working fine. So if you're interested in building this with React, we're gonna do one more video just like this, build the same exact thing using that REST API that we built out, and we'll finish this up with React, and then I'll continue on later with the Django REST Framework series. So I just wanted to make sure, I got a lot of requests asking to build out a real application using this. So I just wanted to give you a real world example. So thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.